They slept safely that night, warm behind their walls, untouched by the darkness pressing at their border, completely unaware that the woman they had just thrown into the rain was the only reason any of them were still breathing. The night they cast her out, the sky was the color of a bruise. Low clouds pressed over the Thorn Ridge settlement, and the torches in the great courtyard burned double rows against the rain, lit deliberately so nothing could be missed. Every face illuminated. Every witness counted. Julie stood in the space the crowd had made for her. Not out of respect. Out of the instinct people have around things they've decided to fear. She was 23 years old. She had healed their sick, set their bones, pulled them back from fevers that should have taken them. She had knelt in frozen earth at midnight and given pieces of herself to walls they didn't know existed. And tonight, Alpha Theo Magnus stood on the raised platform at the courtyard's head and told her, in his measured, reasonable voice, that she was not enough, that she carried no wolf, that she bore no bond, that she was a liability the pack could no longer afford. Julie looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she said the only two words there were, "All right." She turned. She walked. She did not look back. And she had no idea, as she crossed the courtyard's edge into the rain, that the dark force she had spent 3 years quietly dying to hold back was already moving toward them, and that only she could stop it. Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. The torches burned double rows in the rain, and Julie Peterson watched them from the center of a crowd that had arranged itself around her like a wound drawing inward. She stood with her hands loose at her sides, her auburn hair darkening in the wet, her face arranged in the careful stillness she had perfected over 23 years of being the kind of person other people looked through. Around her, the wet cobblestones reflected fire. The air smelled of pine smoke and cold iron, and the distinct unease of a community that had already decided something but needed the ceremony to make it real. Alpha Theo Magnus stood on the raised platform at the courtyard's head. He was not a cruel man. That was the hardest part. He had warm brown eyes that made the verdict harder to hate. He read the pack's decision in the measured voice of someone who had rehearsed it enough times to believe he was being fair. No wolf bond, no bloodline, no place in the pack's continued survival. A liability. The word landed in Julie's chest the way it always did, quietly, without drama, like a stone finding the bottom of a well. She had heard it in smaller ways her entire life, in the way people stepped around her, in the silences after she spoke, in the gratitude that never quite translated into belonging. Now it had a formal shape. She looked at him when he finished. He held her eyes, a man who believed in accountability, even when he was wrong. Around her, the faces of people she had healed, held, stitched back together, stared forward with the specific blankness of witnesses who had already decided what they were witnessing. She recognized them all. The warrior she'd sat with through a fever that should have killed him. The woman whose daughter's infection she'd drawn out through 2 sleepless nights. The elder who had accepted her calendula salves every winter without ever once looking directly at her. They did not look at her now. "All right," she said. The words came out quiet and complete, without bitterness, without performance. She had learned long ago that begging changed nothing and silence was its own kind of answer. She turned. She walked across the wet stone of the great courtyard, and the crowd parted for her, and the torches burned behind her, and she did not look back at a single face. Inside her chest, something she had been bracing against for years finally came to rest. It felt terribly like relief. Like a door she'd been holding shut against the weather had finally been allowed to open, and the storm had already passed, and all that remained was the cold and the quiet and the first difficult freedom of having nothing left to protect. Her cabin was small and practical, which was how she'd built her whole life, nothing unnecessary, nothing that would take too long to leave. The walls held the things that mattered: bundles of dried herb, rows of stoppered jars, a battered healer's kit that had been restitched 3 times. Everything had a use. Everything could be abandoned without ceremony. She had always known, in some bottom-dwelling part of herself, that this was temporary. She had simply hoped the knowing wouldn't arrive this way. She moved through it in the dark without lighting a lamp, folding her spare clothes into the satchel she'd already packed twice in her head, running her thumb over the small wooden box on the shelf above her cot. Marta had carved it for her the winter she turned 12. It was the only thing she took that wasn't strictly useful. She wrapped it in a square of cloth and placed it in the satchel's inner pocket with a care she would not have been able to explain if asked. Marta had found her at the territory's edge when she was 6 years old, sitting in the snow with her hands flat against the frozen ground, perfectly calm, looking at something no one else could see. The pack's elder healer had knelt beside her and placed her own hands against the earth. She'd felt the faint hum of something enormous moving just below the surface, like a river too deep to hear. She'd brought Julie inside and never told anyone exactly what she'd found. She had spent the next 17 years teaching her everything she knew and asking nothing in return except honesty and a promise Julie had never broken. The gift had announced itself fully when Julie was 20, light threading between her fingers like frost catching in branches, a sense of something vast and old waking up inside her hands. They had kept it quiet. They had kept it secret. When the dark force began destroying wolf settlements to the east, then the north, then the west, Julie had gone alone into the forest at midnight and learned, by trial and depletion, how to build the walls that nothing else could. 5 barriers. 5 nights she would not describe to anyone. She had told no one. The pack had seen her growing pallor and called it fragility. Now, zipping her satchel in the dark, she understood with sudden, cold clarity that she had spent 3 years protecting people who were already writing her exit. The understanding did not make her angry. It made her tired. It made her want to get the last of it done. She was almost to the tree line when the vision hit her. It came the way it always did, not like a dream, not like a thought, but like something colliding with her from the inside, filling her skull with a pressure that tasted like cold iron and old stone. She dropped to one knee before she could stop herself. Her palms hit the muddy earth. She felt the dark force in the ground below like a subsonic note too low for ears, organized, deliberate, moving with the purposeful intelligence of something that had learned from its previous approaches. It had been patient. It had observed. It was done waiting. She looked back. Through the rain, the Thorn Ridge settlement glowed against the dark, warm-windowed and impossibly ordinary. She could see the silhouettes moving behind the glass, families at their tables, children being put to bed, warriors changing shifts with the easy confidence of people who believed their walls were solid. She thought about the hours it had taken her to build the last barrier. She thought about how long she'd taken to recover afterward, 4 days she'd told no one about, lying on her cabin floor eating nothing and waiting for her hands to stop shaking. She thought about the night she'd woken face down in the frost and not been sure, for a long, terrible minute, whether she would get back up. She set her satchel down against the roots of a pine. She looked at the settlement for a moment longer, at the light in the windows, at the warm, ordinary lives moving behind glass, and felt something settle in her chest that was neither forgiveness nor resentment, but something older and quieter than either. She had loved this place. She still did. That had never been the problem. She pressed her hands to the earth. The light came immediately. It knew what was needed before she did, racing out from her palms in branching silver-white lines, threading through the root systems, searching for the fractures in the territory's skin and sealing them one by one. She builded deeper this time, anchoring it into the bedrock, feeding it with every resource she had, including the grief, which she hadn't realized until now she'd been saving up for years like lamp oil she'd never let herself burn. The dark force arrived at the border and found her waiting. It pressed. She pressed back. It tested her edges for weaknesses, probing the places where her attention flickered or her energy thinned, and she gave it nothing. She locked down every crack and sealed every gap and held, and held, and held. And then it shattered. And Julie went out like a light, face down in the cold mud outside the border of a home that was no longer hers. Cale was not the kind of man who second-guessed himself on the road. He had been riding the boundary circuit for 6 years, east across the Havard territory line, north through the Pine Corridor, west along the ridge, and he knew the dark and its sounds well enough to read them the way other people read weather. He knew the difference between the silence that meant nothing and the silence that meant something had gone wrong in a way that hadn't announced itself yet. Tonight, 3 miles east of the line, the second kind of silence had been sitting in his chest for the better part of an hour before he saw what caused it. He dismounted before he'd made the decision to. She was cold in a specific way that worried him, not the cold of exposure, but the cold of something spent from the inside, like a fire that had burned through all its fuel and left only ash that still held the shape of what it had been. He turned her gently, and her hands fell open, and he saw the marks on her palms, not wounds exactly, but the faint tracery of something that had moved through her and outward, like lightning captured in skin, already fading. Around her in the mud, the faintest shimmer of silver still clung to the earth where her hands had rested. He did not know what he was looking at. He wrapped her in his coat anyway. She weighed less than she should have. That was the detail that settled in his chest and stayed there. She weighed less than she should have, and she was breathing with the shallow, determined regularity of someone fighting for it without knowing they were fighting, a body's pure autonomic refusal to quit even when its owner had used up everything else. He lifted her onto his horse and set his direction toward Havard. The rain came down and he rode into it, one arm across her back to keep her steady, the other on the reins. His horse, a patient gray gelding named Croft, did not complain about the additional weight. Cale talked to him quietly to fill the dark about the road, about the rain, about nothing in particular. He did not admit out loud that he was afraid of the thing he could feel happening under his arm, which was the pulse of a woman fighting, slowly and without drama, to keep existing. But he rode faster than he needed to. He told himself it was the weather. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and dried calendula and a ceiling low enough that she could have reached it without standing. Someone had laid a fire. Someone had left a cup of water within reach and a bowl of broth on the table beside it, still faintly warm, as though whoever had placed it there had not been gone long. She lay still for a long time before she let herself believe she was warm. She had learned not to trust warm too quickly. But the fire was real, and the ceiling was real, and the ache in her hands was the specific ache of something that had been used completely and was slowly, very slowly, beginning to refill. Healer Signa was compact and silver-haired and had the manner of a woman who said only what needed saying and trusted you to hear it without softening. She told Julie, without preamble, that she'd been very nearly gone, that Kale had arrived with her at the border 3 hours after the attack, that she had not been conscious for 4 days, and that the gift marks on her palms were unlike anything Signa had encountered in 40 years of healing work. She told her this while checking her pulse with calm, professional hands and looking at her palms with a careful attention that said she had seen extraordinary things before and would not make a production of them. Then she handed Julie the broth and told her to drink it slowly. The Havard settlement was smaller than Thorn Ridge and still carrying its wounds. 17 graves in the Eastern Grove, new timber pale against the old in the buildings they'd rebuilt. But what struck Julie, lying in her cot and watching through the window, was how these people moved toward each other. With an unguarded ease she had never seen in a pack before, a way of brushing shoulders and sharing burdens that looked entirely unconscious, as though proximity was not something to be managed, but simply the natural state of people who trusted each other. A small girl named Fry brought her a drawing of a horse with a very long neck. The settlement elder, an old man with hands like roots who had lived through more losses than Julie could count, lowered himself to one knee beside her bed to speak to her eye to eye, as though she were someone worth the effort of descent. Kale sat outside her door for 3 days. She could hear him through the wall occasionally, talking to someone or not talking, simply present, the particular quiet of a person who has decided to stay and is comfortable with the decision. In the hollow places inside her chest, where she had grown used to the cold, something quiet began, tentatively, to grow. It frightened her more than the dark force had. They began arriving on a Tuesday, she knew, because Fry had brought her a drawing with the days marked on it, a child's careful accounting of time rendered in unsteady lines and earnest color. First in ones and twos, then in small groups, then in the hollow-eyed clusters that meant something had broken, not just damaged or strained, but broken at the load-bearing level. The kind of break that leaves people moving with the particular blankness of those who have stopped expecting to arrive anywhere safe. Thorn Ridge survivors, still wearing their pack's insignia, carrying nothing but what they'd run with. Julie watched them come through the Havard gate from the supply cabin's doorway and did not go to meet them. She recognized faces, the geography of people she'd spent years among, the bone structure and posture of a community she'd memorized without meaning to. A broad-shouldered warrior who had once stepped around her in the healing room like she was furniture. An elder with a particular habit of looking past people she had decided weren't worth looking at. A mother who had moved her child away from Julie in the common hall 2 winters ago, quietly, without explanation, as though proximity to her were a thing to manage. Julie had not forgotten. She had forgiven already. That was the particular burden of her nature, the inability to carry anger past its usefulness, but she had not forgotten. She told the gatekeeper to let them all through. She went back to sorting herbs. She worked methodically, the way she always worked, hands knowing the task before her mind caught up, bundles of dried leaf separated into their purposes with the quiet attention of someone for whom usefulness had always been the most reliable form of self-worth. On the 5th day, Theo Magnus came through the gate, and the quality of the air changed. He moved differently than she'd ever seen him move, still contained, still carrying himself with the bone-deep authority of a man who had never not known his place in the world, but changed underneath it in the way stone changes when water has been working at it long enough. He crossed the common ground with a bearing she recognized after a moment as the particular dignity of someone who has done an accounting of themselves and found it devastating and is walking through the world anyway. She felt him see her from across the yard. She met his eyes for 3 seconds, without expression, without performance. Then she turned back to the herbs. She had work to do. She had been feeling it for 2 days, a pressure at the edge of her awareness, like the moment before weather breaks, the birds going quieter in a way that wasn't quite right, the roots of her gift stirring with something between alarm and readiness. She had spent those 2 days eating everything Signa put in front of her without complaint, sleeping every hour her body would accept, walking the settlement's inner perimeter at dusk with her hands brushing the fence posts and feeling for the shape of what was coming. She was not at full strength. She was enough. She had decided that before dawn on the 3rd day, standing at the window and watching the dark at the treeline move in a way that dark shouldn't, slow and purposeful, like something circling. She walked to the settlement's edge in the gray pre-light without telling anyone. The Havard people came out of their doors anyway. They felt it too, the particular silence that falls before something enormous, the absence of the small sounds that usually fill a morning. Frey's mother pulled her daughter back from the window. Then she came outside herself, because that was the kind of people they were. The settlement elder moved to stand with the others without being asked. A dozen warriors took position at the perimeter without waiting for direction. Cale fell into step behind Julie without a word, his hand loose near his blade, though they both knew blades would do nothing useful here. She told him to step back. He stepped back exactly 1 pace. He stayed. She pressed her palms to the earth and let herself open. It came differently this time. Not desperate, not a dying woman giving what she couldn't spare, steady, deep and warm, like a river that had finally found its bed. She built from love this time, deliberate, clear-eyed love for Fry and her drawing of a horse with a very long neck, for the elder's knee in the frost, for Signa's 3 sleepless nights, for the graves in the eastern grove and the people who tended them with such quiet faithfulness, for this imperfect small settlement that had received her without conditions and asked nothing back. The light went deep into the bedrock. The dark force hit the border with the full weight of something that had not been stopped in years, harder than before, angrier, as though it had learned from Thorn Ridge and come prepared. She locked her knees. She stayed on her feet. She held the line with everything she had and then reached for more, finding reserves she hadn't known remained, and held it still. The force shattered and pulled back into the trees. The birds came back, and Julie lowered her hands and sat down deliberately in the frost before her legs made the choice for her. Cale's arm was already there. The light faded from her palms slowly, the way stars fade in morning, not all at once, but each one releasing its hold until only warmth remained. The warmth, she had learned, was the part that lasted longest. It was the part that meant the gift had given something rather than merely spent it. She sat in the frost and breathed and let herself be witnessed, which was harder than anything she'd done that morning. The settlement gathered around her without being directed to, which was not something settlements usually did, but Havard was not a usual settlement. Their faces held the particular expression of people who had understood something important and were still in the moment of understanding it, not yet at speech, not yet at action, just holding the weight of what they'd seen. Theo Magnus stood at the edge of the circle with the Thorn Ridge survivors behind him. She could feel him doing the accounting quietly, with the thoroughness of a man who could not look away from a hard truth once he saw it. The years of unexplained illness cycling through the pack while neighboring settlements fell. the way Thorn Ridge had remained untouched while every community around it bled. The timing of the attacks to the south and east, the near misses that had stopped being near misses once Julie began her midnight work. And then, with the precision of a man used to strategy, the timing of the attacks after her banishment, the accelerating pace, the new intelligence in how the dark force moved. One by one, he picked up each piece. He placed it against the next. He let the picture form without looking away from what it meant about him. He walked forward through the gathering. The people parted for him, not out of fear, not out of habit, but out of the recognition that something important was happening and it deserved room to complete itself without obstruction. He was still Theo Magnus. He still moved like a man who had led for 20 years and knew the weight of it. But something had changed in the quality of his certainty, and everyone present could feel it. He stood before her and went down on one knee in the frost. Alpha Theo Magnus, who had never knelt to anyone in his adult life, pressed his fist to the cold ground and spoke her name. Not her title. Not her function. Her name, Julie, the way names are meant to be spoken when you finally understand what they contain, like something you're handing back to a person after keeping it too long without permission. He said it simply, without ceremony or performance, and the simplicity of it was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. She looked at him for a long, still moment. The weight of 3 years sat between them, 3 years of midnight work and pale mornings, and the careful maintenance of walls no one knew existed. She did not rush. "We can be something different than what we were," she said finally. She reached out her hand. Not to absolve him. Not to welcome him home. But to begin. Winter came properly in the weeks that followed, the kind that settles in without apology, whitening the Havard supply yard and pressing ice into the edges of the window frames. Julie found she didn't mind it. Cold had never bothered her the way it bothered other people. Something in her ran warmer than it used to, a banked heat that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there, and had simply stopped being consumed as fast as it was made. She had begun to notice the difference. She was learning to let herself notice things. She was sitting against the south wall of the supply cabin on a Tuesday afternoon when Cale came to find her, following the sound of Fry singing somewhere inside about a horse she had named Thursday. The sun was low and yellow and very direct, the kind of winter light that asks nothing of you and gives everything it has left. She had her satchel open on her lap, though she wasn't packing it. She'd stopped packing it in her head, stopped rehearsing the leaving, stopped holding herself at the slight interior distance of someone who expects to need to leave quickly. The wooden fox was in her hand. Her thumb traced the shape of it the way it had 10,000 times, and for the first time in a long time, the gesture felt like memory rather than preparation. Cale sat down beside her without ceremony, his shoulder pressed against hers. She let it. They sat that way for a while, the two of them against the wall in the low winter sun, Frey's singing drifting out through the supply cabin's cracked door. The settlement going about its ordinary afternoon around them in the particular way of a community that has survived something together and is still, quietly, grateful. Somewhere at the settlement's edge, the barrier she'd built into the Havard bedrock hummed with the particular steadiness of something that had been built well and meant to last. She could feel it at the edge of her awareness the way you feel a healed bone, not painful, just present, a reminder of what had been mended and how. She thought about the roots going down into the cold earth. How far they reached. How long certain things lasted when they were built with the full weight of what you had left to give. "It's about time," she said quietly, to nothing in particular, to the winter light, to the wooden fox, to the warmth of a shoulder she had not yet learned to take for granted. Cale laughed, low and easy. Inside the walls she had built, her pack went on living. They told me I had nothing to offer. No wolf. No bond. No place among them. What they didn't know, what I never told them, was that I had been holding the dark back for 3 years with my bare hands. Alone. In the middle of the night. While they slept. I don't say that with anger anymore. I say it because someone needs to hear this. Your gift is yours. Even when no one sees it. Even when they name it a liability. Even when they cast you out into the rain and close the gate behind you. You don't stop. You press your hands to the earth. You build the wall anyway. Because that's who you are, not who they decided you were. I found a pack that received me without conditions. I built something that will last. And I stopped bracing for the leaving. It's about time.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.